Hi everyone, this is Broken Angel, and welcome to my February recap of Mark Brunet's one-year plan to learn to draw. Throughout the month, I did my best to focus on increasing my drawing speed while at least maintaining line accuracy, as well as working on my observation, especially under time pressure. There was a break partway through, so there was a bit of dip in quality. By the end though, I more than made up for it. For this month, I worked on gesture drawing, one-point perspective scenes, character line art with a focus on faces, and head construction. As I talk through each week, I'll be showing time-lapse footage so you can follow along with my progress. Let's take a look at how February went. In week 1, I did pretty well with my character line art, but struggled with the rest. For the gesture drawings, I felt pretty rushed since I had less time than January, so they ended up being stiff and had odd shapes. On the bright side, the proportions ended up being decent. The perspective scenes ended up being pretty hard to read. The longer lines were wobbly, the construction lines were too dark, and I had trouble keeping perspective and drawing horizontal and vertical lines correctly. Head construction also came with quite a bit of struggle. A handful of times I forgot to include different parts, like ears, necks, and cheekbone lines, and there were multiple angles that I had a hard time with. On the bright side, the easier angles did turn out okay, and the proportions were generally decent. For the character line art, each of them were decent, though there were a handful of minor mistakes. The main struggle was the eyes, though the rest turned out well. For the week, my head construction improved the most. Overall, even with the struggle throughout the week, it was a good start to the month. In week 2, I ended up struggling quite a bit with my gesture drawings and character line art, but I did well with the perspective and head construction. For the gesture drawings, I still struggled quite a bit, with most of the shapes being incorrect and lacking detail. Luckily, the exaggerations and proportions are getting better. For the character line art, the quality dipped a bit since I took a break, but the early ones were very accurate. Unfortunately, the mistakes tended to be either very minor or very major, without much in between. The perspective scenes had good proportions, and I was able to add more details. Unfortunately, the long lines were still pretty wobbly. For the head construction, most of the shapes turned out well and were accurate. I remembered almost all of the different parts and was able to add extra details on the easier angles. Throughout the week, I improved my head construction the most. Overall, there was a dip in quality due to the break, but I still ended up doing pretty well. In week 3, I struggled with the gesture drawings and did pretty well with the rest. For the gesture drawings, there was quite a bit of a struggle. The shapes tended to be off, and pretty much all of them lacked detail. On the other hand, I did pretty well with adding exaggeration and flow to each of the poses. The proportions were a bit off at the start, but ended up being decent once I added back the lines for the shoulders and the ovals for the torso and pelvis. For the perspective scenes, I did a pretty good job keeping the perspective and drawing the shapes correctly, only making minor mistakes aside from the car on the opposite side in the second one. Even the long lines had some improvement and were a bit less wobbly. Unfortunately, the first one was a bit cluttered, but I tried fixing that by only drawing what was visible for the later ones. For the head construction, I was able to add extra details to the easier angles, and the harder angles were more accurate than before. There was a bit of difficulty with placing facial features on the harder angles, but most of the other ones ended up being good. For the character line art, they turned out pretty well, with only minor mistakes that didn't take away from the drawings too much. I also did a really good job with the placement of facial features. For the week, I improved the line art the most after the quality dipped in week 2. Overall, this was a good week with a lot of progress. In week 4, I did pretty well with each of the areas I practice. For the gesture drawings, I was really happy with the results. One of them was too long, but otherwise the proportions, flow, and exaggerations were good. Also, the shapes ended up being decent, though they definitely could have been better. For the head construction, I had a bit of trouble on the first day since it had a lot of harder references, but I did really well aside from that. The shapes were generally pretty good, and I placed all the different parts correctly, only forgetting a few. For the perspective scenes, I did a good job keeping the perspective, and the longer lines were even less wobbly. There was less cluttering because of the darker lines for the forms, and by the end, I was able to have structures with more difficult shapes. For the character line art, I did a good job with drawing the big shapes and only made a few minor mistakes. Other than having trouble with some of the eyes, the facial features were accurate to the references. I would say that they all turned out well, though the last two were really good. This final week, my gesture drawings improved the most. Overall, this was a strong final week that showed me what I can work on to improve my personal drawings later. February turned out well, even with the break in the middle. For the gesture drawings, I struggled with the time constraint, but gradually improved as the month progressed, especially the shapes. On the bright side, most of the proportions, flow, and exaggerations were pretty good early on and improved by the end of the month. For the perspective scenes, I initially struggled with the line accuracy, but did really well by the end of the month. The problem with the long lines being wobbly continued throughout the month, but it significantly reduced. By the end of the month, I was able to start adding details and making structures more complex. For the head construction, I had a habit of forgetting to place parts, like the ears and cheekbone lines, but it got better as I went. I struggled quite a bit with different angles, but improved as the month progressed. On the bright side, I generally did a pretty good job with the shapes. For the character line art, it was the part that I did the best in each week, aside from week 2. I improved quite a bit with placing the different facial features, and even the eyes, which I struggled with throughout the month, improved to only have minor mistakes. The line quality also steadily improved throughout the month. As I head into March, I'll be moving on to doing 5-minute gesture drawings, 2-point perspective scenes, body construction, and portrait studies. I'll also keep practicing my head constructions and my personal drawings. If you're going through a journey of learning anything, or if you have any tips that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. With that, that's it for February, and I'll see you in March.